Hey guys, welcome back. Let's talk about the Bargainers. You know, those statues that hang out in the depths, have glowing eyes, take pose, and give you really cool equipment. They've been talked about in the community a lot, but nobody has been able to give any real answers as to what is going on with them. Today, I'm going over 7 mysteries about them, and let me tell you, the last one is really interesting. One that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody has talked about before. So kick back and relax while I walk you through it. Let's get started. Number 1. How do they relate to Hylia? Let's start off with the basics. This entity seems to exist as a counterbalance to Hylia. It is unclear if the Bargainer is a single entity, multiple entities, or perhaps an entity that has created multiple smaller versions of itself to accomplish its task. If it is the latter, then Hylia herself may be operating under similar mechanics, splitting herself up to monitor and protect the land. If this is the case, then it is safe to assume that the Bargainer also split itself up, and so these statues we see in the depths are simply a receptacle for those pieces. The statues refer to each other as brethren, and so they certainly behave as though they are distinct individuals. At this point, basically everybody knows that these statues are found under statues of Hylia on the overworld. Specifically the larger statues, like the ones we see in the Temple of Time and the Springs. It is unclear if the Bargainer and Hylia have an adverse relationship. Famously, Hylia was a deity created by the Golden Goddesses to watch over their treasure. We can't be certain if that is the case for this continuity, for as I've brought up countless times, these new games may not be in the timeline as the old ones. It could easily be that Hylia and the Bargainer were created as two sides of the same coin, to balance each other. Where Hylia would preserve life in the overworld, the Bargainer would gather souls and perhaps deliver them for processing in the circle of reincarnation. Unfortunately, there isn't enough information to draw a strong conclusion one way or another regarding him in this game, which is why I leave this one as a mystery. I will say though that there does seem to be a cycle of reincarnation going on, with specific people coming back again and again. The Bargainer could play a pivotal role in that cycle. The fundamentals I've outlined here will be important later on in this list, but for now, let's move on. Number 2. Did they have followers? If the Bargainer is the inverse to Hylia, and Hylia had priests, then it seems that the Bargainer would also have had followers of his own. We see evidence of this with the outfit you can get from them. It does seem to mirror the design of the statues, doesn't it? And the markings on it are quite curious to say the least. It's been brought up before by others that when examining the dark clump item, that gross pulsing blob dropped by Phantom Ganon, it seems contained by a charm known as a Ofuda, often seen in anime and other Japanese media. In my case, first experienced in Sailor Moon, these papers are used by shrine maidens to seal and contain evil spirits. We have seen these papers in other parts of the Zelda series too, such as on the sealing of Death's Sword in Twilight Princess. More important though is that usually these are used by maidens on the side of good or light. I'm not saying that the Bargainer and its followers are evil, merely that it would be a little unusual in media to see basically neutral priests doing this type of sealing. But it makes sense to me. I mean, even the Yika, who are clearly evil, use Ofuda. If you ask me though, I think this outfit is merely one that the Bargainer provided to its followers. As such, Link may be unofficially filling the role of one of these followers by collecting pose for the statues. Given the gloom resistance of the outfit, it would make it ideal for traveling to depths, now wouldn't it? Perhaps long ago in ancient times, maybe even before the Zonai ever came into the depths, the Bargainers had their followers searching and collecting souls in the depths for processing. As for what happened to these followers, and even the Bargainers in general, well, that remains a mystery. Number 3. Did Link receive stolen essence? One thing that I recently realized in my video about Link's extra hearts at the start of Tears of the Kingdom is that both games have a term for the life force inside of a person. It is called essence. The horn statue uses this terminology. I bring this up now because essence is presumably the part of a person that makes up their life force, and perhaps even their soul. The bargainer collects souls to move them along. If we assume that these posts have some essence in them, then we get to an interesting situation involving the Calls from the Depths quest in Tears of the Kingdom. I'm sure you guys already know about this quest. The bargainer communicates with Link through a statue in the Temple of Time, and asks him to gather and bring 4 eyes to his statue in the depths in order to restore him. As a reward, he gives Link a heart container or stamina vessel. Given that we know these containers manifest from a collection of essence, one might question where this essence is coming from that the bargainer is giving. It could be that it is harvested from the posts that are gathered, but that would seemingly undermine the bargainer's purpose. To give that to Link, even as a reward, might involve robbing some souls of an afterlife. Instead, I want to call your attention to another instance in-game, the account of the Yiga clan when encountering the statues. In one of the journals around the Laurelland Depths, they speak of a statue stealing the souls of Yiga members. This is interesting because it implies an outright malicious attack on random people. Perhaps the bargainers see the Yiga as lost souls, and take them with the goal of moving them on to, well, wherever souls go. It however seems feasible that it was harvesting their essence for itself. Coming back to the heart container Link gets, could it be made from essence harvested from Yiga members? The statue is sealed behind a wall, and while the Yiga were at the Great Mine of Hylia under the plateau, I don't think that they found this chamber. Even if they didn't, we know that Hylia statues can transfer power to each other as seen in the Toppled Statue quest. So perhaps the bargainers can do the same? They do after all combine their power to create the Tunic of the Depths and other related armor. Alternatively, the statues themselves may simply be a repository of essence that they have collected, and this bargainer was truly grateful to Link for helping him. If this is the case, then that brings me to my next mystery about them. Before we get to that though, are you enjoying the video? If you are, giving it a like and subscribe really helps the channel out. I'd like to remind you that this content is made possible by the direct support of my patron and channel members. Now, back to the list. Number 4. Can the statues move? The bargainer statues have a very interesting file name in the game's source code. They are listed as Armos. Armos statues appear throughout the series, even as far back as the very first game. They are living statues that move about when touched. Some instances of them are more interesting, such as in Twilight Princess, when Link can control them with the Dominion Rod. In virtually all cases though, the statues seem able to move and have some level of intelligence, even if that is to merely stomp around on some unsuspecting hero and eventually explode. I take the file names in the game with a grain of salt, because it is data that we are not supposed to see. However, there could be something here. If the bargainer statues are Armos statues, and they take life force from others for their own purpose, it could be that these statues once moved around through the depths. Perhaps they were collecting posts themselves and didn't need to rely on followers for the task. Perhaps the bargainer is even lying and simply consuming posts for their own benefit. It's not clear. What is though, is that the bargainer himself doesn't seem too interested in the morality of the soul it harvests. If they are just essence to it, then does it matter if they were a good or bad person in life? Let's say that with enough essence, and that the statue could animate and move around. One might question if this is the reason for their locations on the map. Of course, it is possible that any movement of them is far less, shall we say, mobile than one might expect. While it would be something to see a huge statue walking around in the darkness, it could be that they simply appear where they are needed. That being said, most of the statues that we see are buried in the ground, leading to the question of just how long have they been here. The depths is a mysterious place. I hope someday we get more answers about it. Number 5. Where are the smaller statues? Alright, so we have these statues that correspond with goddess statues on the surface. It doesn't completely add up though, because the number of statues doesn't match up. Let's look at what we know. There are 6 statues at these locations, and each one of them has a large goddess statue above them. The huge mother statue in the Forgotten Temple is matched by a huge father statue on top of the huge cliff in the depths. Following this logic, we can assume that these two smaller bargainer statues would be equivalent to the smaller goddess statues we see in the game, the ones that are located at settlements. If this were the case, we have to ask where all these other smaller bargainer statues are, as there are only two in the game. The one at Lookout Landing, and the one in the flooded entrance to the Great Plateau. It gets a little more interesting when we consider the events of the calamity. Many settlements were wiped out, and as such, no smaller goddess statues remain in those destroyed settlements. It's possible, perhaps even likely, that those statues were destroyed by the calamity's forces to prevent the settlement from being habitable. It does seem that Terrytown, for example, was only able to be established because of the statue that was present there. Assuming that these statues are needed for a settlement, looking over at the Temple of Time on the Great Plateau, we can see even smaller statues around the goddess statue there. Are these smaller ones being grown to replace the ones from the settlements that were destroyed? That is an interesting theory for another day. But given the inverse nature of Hylia and the Bargainer, would it not make sense for there to be baby statues for the Bargainer as well? My point being, it really feels like under each settlement in the depths, there should be smaller Bargainer statues to correspond to the goddess statues we see in towns. And under the Temple of Time on the plateau, it seems like there should be 6 baby Bargainer statues growing, now shouldn't there? Perhaps these statues are not a perfect balance to each other, but then again. Number 6. The Great Sky Balance. The dichotomy of the statues and their placement is interesting, but there is one statue that feels very much out of place, the plain statue below the bottomless pond. This one is buried up to its neck, and on the surface, there is no goddess statue to correspond with it. If we go higher in the sky though, we can see that the statue in the Zonai Temple of Time lines up with it, which raises a few questions. Did the Bargainer statue move to this location to balance the goddess statue in the sky? If you ask me, it seems to be quite the opposite actually. I think that the Great Sky Island, with the Temple of Time attached to it, drifted to this new location to balance the statue in the depths. Consider this. If the Temple of Time was lifted into the sky to protect it from the Demon King's influence as we are told, then shouldn't the temple be above the Great Plateau instead of off to the side of Hyrule Field? Furthermore, after much effort trying to line up the Great Sky Island with the Great Plateau, I have determined that not all of the land masses could have been from that location. This is because in the memories, we can see that it looks basically the same as it does in the present in terms of mountains, cliffs, and even the walls surrounding it. The land masses that make up the Great Sky Island were seemingly risen from other parts of Hyrule, and I believe that they were assembled at this spot specifically to balance this Bargainer statue. Why in the sky though? My thoughts is that it was done to maintain the peace on the Great Sky Island itself, and perhaps make it a safe spot for Link in the future. As such, the place needed a statue of its own. Or perhaps the Zonai Temple of Time was so sacred to them, they felt the need to keep that statue in that place. It's unclear, but what is clear is that the goddess statue is now balancing the Bargainer statue below. But wait, if the statue was moved from the Great Plateau, and the Hylians wouldn't build their Temple of Time until later, then during the time that the new temple was constructed, what was balancing the Bargainer statue under it? Well, I'm about to get to that. Number 7. Did Rauru seal a Bargainer statue? As usual for these videos, number 7 is a deeper one. Think of it as a thank you for making it this far in the video. In this case, let's review what we know about the Bargainer statue under the Great Plateau. It is in a sealed room, its 4 eyes are missing, and it actively reaches out asking for help. The 4 eyes are located at these locations, which happen to be located right next to chasms. If we look back in Breath of the Wild, we can see that each of these chasms had a Sheikah shrine over it. That's a pretty interesting coincidence. But if we look at 2 of these locations in the ancient past of Tears of the Kingdom, we can see that they had shrines of light as well. Unfortunately, the other locations of the chasms cannot clearly be seen in the memories, so it's hard to tell if shrines of light were also in those locations. But I'm going to assume for the moment that they were. We also know that the shrines of light imprison and purify evil, This was further confirmed by the directors in some interviews, though you should always take interviews and Word of God in general with a heavy grain of salt. In this case though, we have in-game text that explains what the shrines are doing. They imprison and purify evil. With those pieces put together, with the 4 eyes of the bargainers in these locations, and with shrines of light once being there, could the imprisoned evil that was being purified be the eyes of the bargainer statue? It gets more interesting when you take into account the location right next door in the depths, the secret spring of resurrection. The bargainer manipulates life and takes spirits to the afterlife, and so it is possible that the spring was fundamentally related to what the bargainer was doing before he was sealed. Why would Rauru and Sonia seal the statue though? Isn't it obvious? They wanted the Great Plateau to be the center of their kingdom. We don't know what happened to the Shrines of Light on the plateau, but the Sheikah ones were erected in the same locations. It could be that until recently, the Sheikah shrines and the monks inside were performing a similar function to the Shrine of Light, that being suppressing the monster population, not through purification via light, but by stasis via time granted by Hylia herself. When the Sheikah technology disappeared, those 4 eyes were left on the surface until one day, a man who could hear the voices of the statues found them. Rauru is a person who claims to want peace, and yet he and his wife went about establishing these shrines to control the monster population, in a way to tame the wild and make this land safe for their people. If this idea about the bargainer statue being sealed is true, even for the sake of establishing their kingdom above it, then maybe we can see that Rauru's peace came at a price. The imprisonment of an entity deemed as evil, when it may have only been acting in the service of whatever it was created for. Thanks for watching the video. If you haven't done so already, liking and subscribing to the channel would be really helpful. Doing that notification thing will make sure new videos show up in your feed. I have to give a deep thank you to my supporters, both channel members and on Patreon. You guys really make what I'm doing possible, and it means a lot to me, especially right now. If you like my content and want to support me directly, check out the link in the description to my Patreon, or join the channel members here on YouTube. Doing so will get you access to my growing Discord where we can talk more directly about upcoming topics, along with whatever other stuff is going on. That's all I got for you today, guys. Be safe and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.